now.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. My name is Joanne Pearson, and I am going to be your tech host today, and I am with CIL of Northwest Florida. And our mission is at CIL is to promote, educate, facilitate, and assist and advocate with and on behalf of people with disabilities in partnership with their communities to achieve their goals for independence. We serve Escambia County, Santa Rosa, Okaloosa, and Walton counties. And we also have 5 core services, which include individual and systems advocacy, information and referral, independent living skills training, peer counseling and mentoring services, and also transition services for ages 14 to 26. Other programs that we also offer, along with some activities, we have an assistive technology program through FAST. We have an amplified telephone system program through FTRI. We do equipment loans. We have social and recreational activities. We offer support groups and community education and training. We have regional consultants for all 5 titles of the American with Disabilities Act, which brings me to our presenter, which is going to be Danny Broxson. He is an independent living skills specialist and peer counselor here at CIL. And then our panelist today is Cheri Hofmann. She is an ADA distance learning and training director with the Southeast ADA Center. So I'm going to turn this over to Danny Broxson. I would ask that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. There is a chat box available if you want to chat amongst yourselves, but we ask that any questions that you want to field to the presenter or our panelist to please put them in the Q&A box. And those will be fielded at the end or possibly as we go. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you, Joanne. And I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedule and their work schedule to attend this training. And I hope you would find this both educational and informational and beneficial for whatever your need may be. So before we get into the Title I and the accommodations part of the presentation, just want to, if we can move forward one slide, talk a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is just a brief overview. And I think the important thing that we want everybody to know that this is a landmark civil rights law. And for our purposes today, it guarantees equal treatment for people with disabilities or individuals who have an association or relationship with someone who has a disability. And that's going to be important as we move forward and talk about the different aspects and facets of Title I of the ADA. Next slide. Now, our purpose today is to talk about Title I, which is employment protections, but it's also important to know that there are 5 titles of the ADA. So we're going to focus on Title I, but as you can see, Title II deals with public entities and transportation. Title III is public accommodation. Title IV is telecommunications, and 5 is the technical provision, but we're going to focus on Title I today. Next slide. And this is just a little bit of information for you as it relates to the unemployment rate versus the labor force participation. And it's important for you to realize or to make note of that these statistics are pre-COVID. So this is as of July 2019. So if we look at this, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities at that particular time was 7.7%. At the same time, people without disabilities was 3.7%. If you contrast that with the labor force participation, people with disabilities was at 20.9%, and people without disabilities was 69.1%. So as we move forward and we talk about the different accommodations and things, that just puts a little perspective into things as we move forward. Now, Title I of the ADA, and this is just the basics, okay? So we have employers. It's important to know that employers cannot discriminate against people who have disabilities in regard to any aspect or any employment practices or terms or conditions or privileges of employment. So what does this mean exactly? This is from the entire interview process, the application process, the hiring process, and the upward mobility once you've attained employment. Okay, but it's also important for you to know that with all these protections, that it does not mean that they have to hire you because of your disability. You still have to be able to perform or to be qualified for the position and to perform the essential functions of the job. Next slide. There are some ADA exemptions. So private employers with fewer than 15 employees, the federal government, corporations fully owned by the government, private membership clubs, U.S. government executive agencies, Indian nations, businesses operating in foreign countries, if compliance violates foreign law. Okay, so what does this mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that the government is off the hook. In many cases, there are laws that are applicable, such as state laws, or in the instance of the federal government, the Rehab Act would take care of those. So in some way, shape, or form, the ADA applies in all aspects. Next slide. ADA Title I qualified applicants. Okay, so an employer cannot discriminate against a qualified applicant and employees on the basis of a disability. A qualified applicant is an individual who meets the skill, experience, education, and other job-related requirements of the position held or desired, with or without reasonable accommodation. They want to make sure that you can perform the essential functions of the job. Next slide. So let's talk about reasonable accommodation. A reasonable accommodation is any change in the work environment or how things are usually done that results in equal employment opportunity for an individual with a disability. A business must make a reasonable accommodation to a known physical or mental limitations of the person with the disability, unless it can show that the accommodation would cause undue hardship on the operation of the business. Now, as you think about that, we're going to talk and dive into more detail and give you a few more examples as we move forward. But I just want you to be aware that every side has rights, and every side can make an argument to the reasonable accommodation and their requirements and protections on both sides. So next slide. So some examples of reasonable accommodation as it relates to job accommodation would be using assistive technology such as readers or JAWS or screen readers, audio text software. Could be something as simple as a schedule change in break times depending on the disability, the request to work from home, or using job aids. Next slide. Some other examples of reasonable accommodation are change in the work location, change in work environment, change in equipment, the elimination or exchange of marginal job tasks, okay, or reassignment or even leave. But it's important to keep in mind as we talk about all of these different types of accommodations that those accommodations are done on a case-by-case basis, and there's not really one size fits all. So not everything is reasonable. So we can't assume that just because somebody has a disability, makes a request from the employer, that those accommodations are reasonable, because they may not be. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about essential functions. The reason the job exists is to perform that function, whatever the job is. Only a few employees can perform the function. The function is not highly specialized, that the employer hires people into the position specifically because of their experience and performing the essential functions. So, as an example, if you're hired as a receptionist and the sole purpose of the job is to answer the phone, answer a multi-line telephone, take messages, and to distribute the mail, the most obvious essential function of the position is to be able to answer the phone, take messages, and distribute the mail. So let's say that management comes in one day and says, oh, by the way, we would like you to enter client forms into the database as well, but only once a week. So that would be considered a non-essential function. So as a receptionist, your job would be to just handle the essential functions of the job, and that's what's covered under the ADA. Reasonable accommodation. Next slide. Things to know: the presence of a disability does not result in presumptive reasonable accommodation. We have, there's all kinds of disabilities, and the truth is, just because you have a disability does not necessarily mean that you would need an accommodation for the job that you're working on. The person with a disability has a responsibility to disclose his or her need for accommodation. Okay, and we'll talk about disclosure a little bit later on, but the person with a disability has the responsibility to disclose his or her disability or need for accommodation. Reasonable accommodations should be reviewed, and employers may ask for documentation of a disability. Next slide. There are many people with non-obvious disabilities. Most disabilities are not obvious, yet they have an impact on daily lives. For instance, if you have arthritis, or you may have an intellectual disability, or you may have HIV/AIDS, you may have a seizure disorder that many people are not aware of. This can lead to misunderstanding and greater stigmatization. Next slide. So who has rights under the ADA? The ADA applies to applicants or employees who have a disability or have a record of having a disability or are regarded as having a disability. And we're going to dive into each one of those specifically. Next slide. The first thing you have to do is define what is a disability. And it is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Now, important note, employers are not required to provide accommodation to employees that are, quote unquote, regarded as having a disability. And we want to talk about that for a second, because the test focuses less on the extent of an individual's actual impairment and more on how others perceive the individual, as well as the effect of those perceptions on the attitudes towards and the assumptions about the individual with a disability. For example, a woman applies for a job as a customer service representative at a department store. Her face is badly scarred from an automobile accident, so the interviewer doesn't want to give her the job in spite of her skills and experience because he thinks customers will be uncomfortable looking at her. She's not substantially limited in any major life activity, but the interviewer is regarding her as if she has a disability. So that's a great example of regarded as having a disability, and the assumptions that people make and the issues. That's just one example of some of the issues that potential employees face. Now, next slide. This is one of the reasons for the Americans with Disabilities or Americans with Disabilities Amendment Act of 2008. And it made a number of significant changes to the meaning and interpretation of the ADA definition of disability to ensure the definition would be broadly construed and applied without extensive analysis. So, for example, if you had an individual who was diabetic and was on insulin or insulin dependent, before the Americans with Disability Amendments Act, some cases said that because the diabetic or diabetic condition was mitigated, the condition would no longer substantially be limiting. But the truth is that broadened the definition. Therefore, people with disability or people with that were diabetic who were insulin dependent could even if their condition was mitigated, could be included in that definition. And I just want to remind everybody at this point that if you have any questions or things that you would like to bring up, if you will go ahead and, as we're going through the PowerPoint, if you will type your questions in the chat box or comments or anything, if you will take care of that so that we can be sure to answer your questions. So let's go on to the next slide. And it's important to know who has rights under the ADA. So qualified individuals are who are pre-employed applicants full-time employees, part-time employees, seasonal employees or seasonal workers, or temporary workers. So those are the employees that are covered under the ADA. Next slide. So it's important to know, if we know who's covered, so we want to know who has rights under the ADA. The ADA and the association provision prohibits the discrimination against a person whether or not he or she has a disability because of his or her known relationship or association with a person with a known disability. The ADA does not require a family relationship for an individual family relationship for an individual to be protected by the association provision. A reasonable accommodation to a person without a disability due to the person's association with someone with a disability. And this is important, and if you're wondering what all that means is, if you have a child with a disability, you cannot be discriminated against. Somebody can't say, well, because they have a child with a disability or because they have a family member with a disability, that you would not be able to perform the essential functions of the job. Next slide.
Danny, can I go further on that about the association?
Absolutely.
Being a person that runs a technical assistance line at all for the ADA too, we get a lot of calls about a parent that has a child, for instance, that has multiple sclerosis or MD or a number of autism, and they believe that their employer should accommodate them based on that child's disability because, and so an employer does not have to reasonably accommodate a parent with a child with a disability because it is the individual that is being accommodated, not the child. If I'm expanding on that a little bit more, because a lot of people believe that they should be able to get a reasonable accommodation to attend doctor visits. And unfortunately, it only falls under FMLA or the kindness of heart of an employer to be able to go that route. And not everybody has FMLA these days.
Right. So we would hope that an employer would understand the situation and be as supportive and accommodating as possible, but they're not legally required to do that. So let's talk a little bit about disclosure versus self-identification. And disclosure is voluntarily sharing information about a disability. And self-identification is the invitation from an employer to voluntarily check a box that says the individual has a disability, anonymous, typically used for data collection purposes. Okay, and the Section 503 prohibits federal contractors and subcontractors from discriminating in employment against individuals with disabilities and requires these employers to take affirmative action to recruit, hire, promote, retain all of these individuals. As revised, the regulations strengthen the affirmative action. That doesn't mean that the requirements get watered down or changed, or you still have to be able to perform the essential functions of the job. But what it does, it levels the playing field and it opens the door for opportunities for people with disabilities. Okay, next slide. And this is an important question. Why do we disclose? And we've talked with students about this, and some of them, as you know, probably, as you can imagine, they probably don't want to disclose that they have a disability. but there is a way to do that. So why would a person disclose that they have a disability? Okay, so the person has an obvious disability and wants to address any concerns head on. Okay, that would be one reason. The person needs an accommodation to participate in the interview or to do the job. Disclosure would offer competitive advantage in the selection process, and that goes back to what we were talking about, the affirmative action part. The person wants to bring his or her whole self to work, and they want to explain the participation of perhaps, and this isn't in every case, but maybe you have a job coach or an employment specialist in the interview process or in the employment process. So as a reminder, as we move forward, if you have any questions about any of these particular topics or subtopics, please put those into the Q&A box and we'll get to those questions. Now, we talked about some good reasons why somebody would disclose, but there is an art to disclosure, and there's good disclosure, and there's a way to do it in a productive way. And what you want to do when you disclose about a disability, you want to focus on the needs, and you want to provide suggestions or reasonable accommodations. So you want to bring something to the table when you're talking to your employer or potential employer about the accommodations, or when you're talking about your disability. Be specific rather than general. How my disability affects my ability to perform the essential functions of the job. You want to make the conversation primarily about the job and why you're the best candidate for the job, but how the disability affects your ability to perform the essential functions of the job. Focus on the job qualifications and not the disability, okay? Because it's really easy to talk about the disability, but what you want to focus on is the job qualification. And to continue, if we move on, we talk about, next slide, the art of disclosure. Again, we're talking about good disclosure. So in good disclosure, you want to avoid medical terms or labels, okay? You want to discuss work barriers, not the diagnosis of the disability. And you also want to focus on the here and now and not the negative aspects of the disability. You want this to be a positive experience, not only for you, the person with the disability, but for the employer. Next slide. The next thing to talk about, and it's important to talk about when you're talking about disclosure, is to whom do I disclose? And it varies greatly, of course, depending on the employer and the situation, okay? So your possible audiences are your recruiter, hiring managers, supervisors, managers, human resources, the EEO staff, coworkers, health and safety staff. In all of those cases, whatever the case may be, whatever job you're applying for, the important thing that I want you to take away from this slide and that information is that you only need to tell who needs to know. So if it's somebody that is not, if it's inconsequential that they know, you're probably better off not telling them. But you only have to tell the people that would impact you. Next slide. So the accommodation basics. There's no standardized form or set of basic information required. Okay, your request can be made verbally. It can be made in written form. It can be sent in an email, or somebody can make the request for you. If they see that you're having an issue, they may go and say, well, we think so-and-so needs this. But any one of those forms of request are acceptable. Next slide. Now, an employer responsibilities in reasonable accommodation process. There's a process to this. Remember, it may not be as quick as making the request one day or getting the request granted the next day. First, you have to recognize the request for an accommodation has even been made. So you want to begin an interactive process with the employee and also confirm the existence of a disability, determine the essential functions and marginal functions of the job, and that's an important conversation to have. You want to investigate solutions, and then you want to implement the accommodation, and you want to document the accommodation, and that's helpful and useful and important for both sides to accommodate that a request has been made. But the most important thing that I want you to take away from this is that it's an interactive process between you and the employer. And you should be involved in the process together. And there should be agreement. And the ultimate decision is based on what is effective for you. And it's important to realize that not all accommodations fit everybody. So what works for you, what is an accommodation for you may not necessarily work. And that's why communication is so important between an employer and an employee or a prospective employee moving forward. Next slide. An employer's rights in reasonable accommodation process. Okay, an employer is not required to honor accommodation requests that, number one, create an undue hardship for the business. Okay, if it's going to be expensive or disruptive to the way that the business is run, if it's too costly, or it fundamentally changes the essential function of the job, and this is important because I'm sure they get a lot of requests, if it's dangerous or illegal. Okay, so that's the employer's rights and responsibilities as far as the job accommodation is concerned. Also, the employer's rights and responsibilities in reasonable accommodation process. Granting an accommodation does not result in eliminating the essential functions of the job or reducing the performance standards of the job. If you'll go to the next slide. Okay, so remember we talked about how it equals the playing field or levels the playing field between people that have disabilities and those that don't. So we're never talking about eliminating the essential functions of the job, because that's the whole point of the job in the first place, to perform essential functions. And we're not reducing the performance standards of the job. Okay, next slide. This one talks.
Hey, Danny, before you go on with that, on the past slide on the performance standards, sometimes people don't understand that question. And I think a good example of a performance standard is some of these telemarketing jobs require that you make 10 calls an hour, or you make 5 sales a day or something like that. And a person says that they use maybe JAWS and it's slower. And so that JAWS in itself is the accommodation, but reducing or eliminating those standards because that person is slower is not the accommodation. They still have to meet the qualifications that are required for the job without reducing those standards.
Right, and that's so important for people to realize, because we talk to a lot of people who think just because they have a disability that somehow that lowers the standards, and that's not the case at all. So in terms of documentation, if you'll go to the next slide, Joanne, I'm sorry. Documentation. So what does the employer have the right to request? He has the right to request documentation about the disclosed disability. And catch that, the disclosed disability. The documentation he requests must be job related and consistent with business necessity. Disability documentation must be kept confidential, and it must be kept in a secure file that is separate from the employee's work file. Next slide. Okay, and this is just a graph of things that we've been talking about, and we mentioned early on about the entire process of the hiring process is covered under the ADA, from the time of pre-employment, the interview, and all the things. So this is just a documentation or a graph of what is covered all the way through pre-employment, and talking about the pre-employment, post-offer, and then employment and an inquiry into the disability as it relates to the job accommodation. So that's really good information. It helps to keep everything in perspective when going through the process. Next slide. Okay, now we talked about what the employer can do and what they can ask, but what can't employers ask in a disability inquiry? Okay, so going through whether a person has or had a disability, medical documentation of condition, genetic information, prior workers' compensation history, or current or past prescription medication use. So basically, employers can't dig for information because they're concerned about the cost of accommodation, or because they think the medical insurance would be affected by a person's disability, or purposely attempt to screen out people with disabilities from an employment process. So it's very clear they can't do that. Next slide. When are accommodations unreasonable? Okay, and these are things that an employer might argue. And any change to the work environment or how things are usually done that result in equal employment opportunity for an individual with a disability. Employers are not required to change the essential functions, and only essential functions can be accommodated. So remember, we talked about things that might be considered once you get into a position. You have the differences between essential functions and non-essential functions, and only essential functions can be accommodated. Next slide. What is considered an undue hardship or reasonable accommodation for a reasonable accommodation? So we already established that an employer is not required to make an accommodation if it would impose an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. Undue hardship is defined as an action requiring significant difficulty or expense. when considered in light of the number of factors. These factors include the nature, the cost, the accommodation in relation to the size and the resources, the nature and the structure of the employer's operation. Next slide. Okay, now if you're looking for other information or more in-depth information, one of the great resources that we use, and I'm sure Cheri can talk a little more about this, is the Job Accommodation Network, or the JAN, I think it's jan.org. You can get a lot of information about rights and responsibilities of employees, rights and responsibilities and resources of how to do all of the things that we've been talking about, making a request, making an accommodation request, what your rights are. So if you ever have if you need information and want good information, the Job Accommodation Network is an awesome resource.
And let me expand on that too, Danny. This agency is actually located in West Virginia, and at one given time, the largest amount on their staff are 14 employees, but each one of them have experience in, for instance, blindness, like I put here, or a person who's deaf and hard of hearing, or a person who has cerebral palsy, and they said that they probably heard it all, but even if they hadn't, they are really the experts in trying to figure out good, effective accommodations for an employee, something that you might never have thought of, or something that you thought of but they can expand on. They have the ability to go extra steps that other people can't go, like you said, assisting them through their accommodation request, everything. And they recently changed their website to askjan.org. But their website is absolutely phenomenal. They have a search online resource called SOAR. And, you can type in like mental health, or you can type in bipolar or blindness, and amazing white papers come up, suggestions on accommodations. I in what I do, refer people to the Job Accommodation Network 9 times out of 10 with a Title I question.
Wow. And I think on the next slide, they actually have the phone number, and it says connect with Jan, and it gives you the phone number, and it gives you some resources, some publications, but that would definitely be worth your while if you have, whether you're an employer or a potential employee or an existing employee. It's good information, and it's not just about gotcha, here's the law, but it's also interactive, because it tells you how to make that accommodation, and basically, you guys are on the same team, and if you're going to work for the same company, that it really helps you work together to accomplish that accommodation, so that it can be effective and beneficial to the employee and the employer, and ultimately what's best for the business as well. So,
and Danny, they actually have a live chat area now. I just absolutely love it. If you have an immediate question, you can actually go into their chat area. Somebody actually is in that chat area. They will start the discussion with you, and if it needs to go to a technical assistant, you're immediately in that queue. So it might be more beneficial if somebody wants to chat first before calling, because sometimes, especially pre-COVID, was a little bit easier with the phone calling, but post-COVID, not as good. So the chat area is almost a better area to go into.
Well, and if you think about an employer who's not sure about something during the interview process, or the post-interview process, or even the pre-interview process, if the person has a disability, they can chat live with somebody and get real-time answers, and it would make them seem really smart, and to get the best possible legal answers to questions. It would be awesome. Thank you, Cheri. I think we've come to the portion of the question and answer portion. I don't know if we have any in the chat or in the Q&A box.
Well, I've been monitoring the Q&A and there aren't any questions. If anybody has any burning questions, they might want to put them in now. Or they can email you afterwards, Danny, and I'm happy to be on a standby to answer any questions that they might not be wanting to ask today.
There is my contact information for any of you that have any questions, or maybe you know somebody who has some potential issues or might be going through the employment process or going through an issue. Feel free to email me. If I don't know the answer, I'm not afraid to tell you that I don't know the answer, but I will always go and find the right person to get you the best answer. And I know Joanne's here as our tech host, but sometimes people need an advocate, and she's a great advocate for people with disabilities. So we can get you connected with the right answer and the right person. So if you have any questions or you think about something, 12 o'clock at night, you're thinking, oh, I should have asked this question, just email me and let me know, and we'll get on top of it.
And if I could do the shameless commercial as well, with the Southeast ADA Center, we do represent the 8 southern states, with Florida being one of them. And so you're always welcome. If the question is very technical in nature, or you even want to give it to your client, that number is 800-949-4232. And you can call 24/7 on that line too. If you want to call at midnight and like when it triggers, like Danny said, and leave a message, somebody always gets back to you 24 hours after a phone call, and usually 48 after an email. It just depends on how busy they are. But most of the folks that work the technical assistance line have been involved with the ADA since its inception, up to about 25 years. So that's all good.
So as you see the disclaimer that is up on the screen right now, you can see that it's got all of our participating sponsors and people that are kind of help put this together. But I also want to say this, and I think I had said this in a previous webinar, that we do not provide legal advice. And it's never our intention to offer legal advice. We are not attorneys. We are advocates. We are peer mentors. We are independent living skills specialists. If it turns into a legal matter, we can refer you, and we can refer you to the Southeast ADA Center that will tell you what the ADA says, what your rights may be. And Cheri can speak to this a little more, but they don't. It's my understanding that they don't tell you what to do, but they tell you what your rights are and give you some options and then walk you through that process. There's other organizations that help with the legal aspect and the discrimination aspect of it. Our goal is to educate both employers and employees and businesses and help them understand what the ADA is, how it applies to them, how it affects them, and what the rules are, what the law says, so that everybody can be in compliance, so that everybody can be as independent as they need to be. But just want to say that we do not offer legal advice. We're not attorneys, so that's important as well.
And I will expand on that as in working with the Southeast ADA. We do not hold the force of the law either. We're not an enforcement agency, but we do have the expertise to walk you through the law. And as Danny explained earlier in the PowerPoint, not everything's covered. So sometimes it's almost a person's already got one foot out the door, or they've already been terminated, and it's kind of a coulda, shoulda, woulda. Keep in mind that if you're talking with people, that employers don't have a glass ball in front of them. They don't know sometimes what to ask. They don't know that you have a disability. They don't know that the struggle is real. So that's where that interactive process comes in. It's very important. I wish that they had a big poster that went on a board. I mean, that's kind of been something that I've always wanted for so long, how to ask for reasonable accommodations, when to ask for them. And so I think the best thing for all of you to do today is to take those numbers in stride, call if you have a question, give an employer the phone number. I can tell you with the Southeast ADA Center, let's say Danny called me today and he had a question, but then somebody turned around and said, I have this employee named Danny and they called the same day. We would never say, oh yeah, we talked to Danny. Everybody's call is confidential. We don't talk about another person's call, because one thing I can honestly tell you, the case may change, but the law doesn't.
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
Well, thank you everyone for attending our webinar today. If you need further information, the contact information was given to you. Also, you can email info@cilnwf.org, or you can visit our website for further webinar offerings and events at www.cilnwf.org. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you again for attending our informational webinar.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you, everybody.